We here at the Sports History Network proudly partner with 26 podcasts, all revolving around the history of sports. But did you know that many of our hosts were sports history authors way before they started their shows? It's true. We've got Joe Ziemba, host of When Football Was Football, Joe Zagurski, host of Pro Football in the 1970s, Mark Morthier, host of Yesterday's Sports, Tommy Phillips, host of Lombardi Memories, and Scott Adamson, co-host of From the 55-Yard Line. All these authors have many books for you to choose from. To check them out, go to our website at sportshistorynetwork.com/sportshistorybooks. Pick up your copy today. Soundtrack provided by Kevin MacLeod of filmmusic.io.
This podcast is part of the Sports History Network, your headquarters for the yesteryear of your favorite sport. You can learn more at sportshistorynetwork.com.
Hello and welcome to the Sports History Network Showcase, our in-house show featuring SHN podcasters talking sports, talking history, and talking sports history. My name is Oz Davis, host of the Sports History Network's Truly the Goats podcast. Joining us this time on the showcase is Ariel Gonzalez of Wrestling with Heels On, the new show here at Sports History Network. Ariel, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me on.
All right, let's get into it. First question I usually ask any fan of wrestling.
Well, I think what's great about pro wrestling is that it is life, without sounding a little too highfalutin here, but it is really life on a microscopic scale, right? I mean, we have good guys, bad guys. You have all the drama that's inherent in everyday life, sized down to a squared circle, and everything is contained in there. It's really a soap opera between two people played out before a huge crowd. And, you know, it's really just life boiled down to two people in a squared ring. And it's exciting and dramatic.
Let's talk first about your own fandom. How did you become a fan?
Well, I was probably 9 or 10 years old when I first started watching professional wrestling. My father introduced me to it. We would watch together on Saturdays. Most of the time when we watched together, it was midnight wrestling, because at the time, WWOR, which was the Secaucus station in New Jersey, they had pro wrestling on. WWF was on 3 times a day. It was on 11 a.m., 5 p.m. if they didn't have a Mets game on, and then at midnight. So I was on a steady diet of professional wrestling every Saturday. I was watching it. Yeah, I wouldn't miss it. You couldn't miss it. And then at midnight, that's when my dad and I would just get together and watch, and he'd tell me who was who, and you know who had a feud with who, and it was great. It was not only was a great bonding time for he and I, but it was also really just a good introduction into athletics in general, because you know I wasn't questioning whether it was real or not back then. I took it for granted. This was real deal. People were hurting each other, and these were real athletes, and you know, how did two men get in there and beat the crap out of each other all this time and not wind up on stretchers, you know? But that was my introduction to wrestling. Saturdays were my day.
So this is like the mid 80s, right?
This was late 70s, early 80s.
Oh, wow.
Early 80s. Okay. Yeah.
Early
so I'm talking
80s.
about
Okay.
Yeah, probably 81.
Okay. So who were some of your early favorites?
Early favorite wrestlers? Well, Bob Backlund was a favorite champion, because I was so impressed by Bob Backlund because he took on all comers. This was a guy who nowadays, I mean, probably would never be considered a champion because of his size, and he had that baby face look, he looked like Howdy Doody a little bit, and probably wouldn't be the champ that he was back then, but he had so much wrestling talent that he could take on all comers. He was taking on guys as big as Big John Studd to guys that were as small as like Playboy Buddy Rose or Don Muraco, another great bad guy. So Bob Backlund took him on all, and he was a great champion. I think he really was a people's champion. He really was, and I never saw him back down from anybody.
Well,
so he was one of my favorites.
He came out of the classical wrestling tradition, didn't he?
Yeah, I believe he was a college wrestler.
Yeah, that's what
very
I was
much,
thinking. Yeah.
very much in the vein of like Kurt Angle, people like that,
Yeah.
Kurt Hennig,
Yeah.
people that had really solid amateur wrestling backgrounds.
Yeah, because he used to wear like the classic uniform.
Yeah,
right?
the singlet.
With
He
the
had
strap.
that singlet.
Yeah, exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. That
Yeah.
nobody wore anymore at that
That
time.
nobody.
Yeah,
Right.
everybody was dropping that, right?
Right.
So, wow. Okay, I gotta stop right now and apologize to the listeners who are not fans of early '80s professional wrestling, but this is hitting me right in the sweet spot. Just like professional wrestling hit us right in the sweet spot. I mean, there were certain things for people who are that age at that time that just got us and hooked us. MTV, Pac-Man, and professional wrestling, especially the WWF, right? I mean, this stuff was catnip for especially boys our age at this time. So apologies to the listeners for that. Well, let me ask you this. From my perspective, as somebody getting into sports history heavy these days, to me, history is becoming less and less of a big deal to sports fans. And I think even more so in something like professional wrestling. So how did you get into wrestling history?
Well, I've always been curious. I mean, I think part of the lure of wrestling, it's like going to a magic show. You sit there and you watch the magician and you love the tricks, but always in the back of your mind, you're thinking, how did they do that? How did that happen? And who is this guy really? So that was my gateway into trying to find out more about the wrestlers, who they were in real life, and getting into the nitty gritty of what was behind the scenes. What does it take to put on a wrestling match? And who were these people behind the mask, the characters that they were playing? So that was my entry point into wanting to know more about the history, and then finding out who these people really were, and then delving into their biographies. So some finding out more about what they were like when they weren't in the ring. I was, just like you would with a favorite actor, right? You wouldn't just take their movies at face value. You'd say, well, yeah, I'd like to know what Bruce Willis is like when he's not on the screen, So that's the kind of curiosity that got me into the history of wrestling.
Right, and then you delve into the story of somebody like Jake the Snake Roberts, and then you wish you hadn't.
Right. That's a sad story.
There actually is a documentary, full-on documentary about him now. He was part of another documentary that I recently reviewed on the Game Film podcast here at the Sports History Network. And then somebody, I guess, saw this 20 minutes of this documentary film and then made a whole documentary about him. And it's some wild stuff. Even if you're not particularly into wrestling, wow. Talk about like a fascinating degenerate lifestyle. Really amazing. But this guy was hardcore.
I remember the first time I'd seen anything about Jake the Snake was in a movie called Beyond the Mat.
Yes, that's the one. That's the one that we watched.
Yeah, and I believe that one covered Mick Foley as well as The Rock,
right.
And it really focused on Mick Foley. But then when they went into the Jake the Snake stuff, that was so depressing, and it really shed that dark side of the professional wrestling that many people, including myself, had no idea really existed. You'd heard rumblings about it, but to see Jake the Snake living it out was very, very depressing and eye-opening.
Well, now we kind of do, right? Because of the wrestler. Did you enjoy that movie? What did you think of that?
I did. I enjoyed that movie immensely. First of all, I was always a big Mickey Rourke fan.
Yeah.
And when I saw The Wrestler, I said, this is probably the closest they're going to get to a Rocky wrestling movie in my lifetime anyway. And that's what it reminded me of. It reminded me of Rocky, and it had a lot of emotional ring to it. I love that they took the sport seriously. They didn't make it a joke. And they made that the work that these guys do, the men and the women that are in wrestling, it's real work. It's painful when you see people getting hurt. When you see, just like you said a little while ago, these people are doing this 12 months a year. There is no break for them. There is no off season. They work hard, and it's sad later on in life when they pay for it physically. But they're hardworking people, and bad things happen to them, as well.
Okay, we're gonna shift gears here because ostensibly this show is about doing podcasts for the Sports History Network. How did you get into the podcasting game?
Well, I'm very new to this. I have 2 shows in the can, so to speak. My first show was on Blackjack Mulligan. My second show that just came out was on Abdullah the Butcher. How I got into it is kind of funny. I have a good friend of mine at work named Frank Redding, and Frank, I believe you recently interviewed Frank.
No, I got him coming up.
Oh, you got him coming up. Okay.
He'll be on the next episode of SHN Showcase.
There you go. Frank is a walking encyclopedia, in my opinion. He knows so much about a lot of different topics. And he and I got to talking one day at work, and he knew so much about boxing. And I knew a bit about boxing from an introduction that I had with my dad. And so we were talking about the same history. And I told Frank, I said, you need a podcast, man, because you have so much information. I feel like you're depriving all these people, all that wealth of knowledge that you have in your brain. So you have to have an avenue to let that out. So somehow, like maybe a month later or so, Frank gets back to me and goes, "Hey, Ariel, guess what? I got a podcast." I said, "You got a podcast? That's amazing." He goes, "Yeah, and I want to thank you for pushing me in that direction." So a little bit later on, he asked me, he introduced me to Arnie, and he said, "Hey, would you like to meet Arnie Chapman?" And introductions were made, and I told Arnie that I had a little bit of an inkling of wanting to get into the podcast arena myself, and he facilitated that, and I've been very lucky, and I love it. I mean, I'm wondering why I didn't do this sooner.
Hi everyone, my name is Ariel Gonzalez, originally from Brooklyn, now living in the Garden State. I have a new podcast show called Wrestling with Heels On, brought to you by the Sports History Network, of course. On the podcast, I get to reminisce about my favorite wrestling bad guys from yesteryear. Light on stats, but heavy on nostalgia. This little trip down villainy lane gives me a chance to visit the dark corridors of my wrestling soul. And it's also fun to have a podcast. So join me as I wax nostalgic about my favorite wrestling weirdos and ne'er-do-wells, the no-goodniks of a no longer time that still haunt me today. Just keep in mind, like some people my age, my recall of people and events can get a little wobbly sometimes, so don't worry if I get it wrong. Oh, what do you expect? I'm wrestling with heels on.
All right, let's talk about wrestling with heels on. Now, I've listened to, I mean, you say you have 2 episodes, but you actually have like 2.5, right? Because you have the introductory episode.
Oh yeah, that's right.
Which I think is actually very good as well. Now, the second episode is about one of my all-time favorites. We rarely saw him on the TV back in my day because he wasn't really WWF. What was he, like, AWA? Like he was in one of these other leagues.
He was everywhere.
Yeah. I rarely caught him in the WWF, and but he was notorious. We used to buy the magazines, and there'd always be a story about Abdullah the Butcher.
Oh
He's a
yeah,
classic.
yeah.
So, but in general, tell the listeners, please, explain the concept of your podcast.
Sure. So for me, the podcast is about, it's not just about picking out villains, because if I wanted to, I think anybody could just go through a laundry list of villains and say, okay, this villain was great, this villain was great. It's how each of these villains affected me. It's taken from a very personal vantage point of how the villain impacted my life, whether it was my relationship with my dad, or whether it was maybe a fear it instilled in me, or like the first episode with Blackjack Mulligan was not just about Blackjack Mulligan. It was kind of a little bit about censorship, a little bit about what's scary about the things we don't see as opposed to the things we see. And very often our imaginations, whatever is lurking in there, is a lot scarier sometimes than what we actually see, So there's a little bit of subtext in there. There's a little bit of a lot of personal stuff that comes out, but it's all connected to how the villain brought this out in me, because these are wrestlers that had an impact beyond the match, an impact in my imagination, an impact on me emotionally, and that's the perspective that I take.
Really interesting. Okay, I wasn't expecting that answer. I'll be honest with you. Very good. All right, let me ask you this though. I want to pick a little nit here, because I was thinking about this, and really, doesn't almost every wrestler that you can think of, maybe not Abdullah the Butcher, but almost every wrestler you can think of, take at least one turn at being the good guy and one turn at being the bad guy? I mean, I remember when Hulk Hogan became a bad guy. It's like the last guy in the world, or Andre the Giant, the last dude, Superfly Snuka, that you would suspect to become a bad guy. So how do you make the distinction here? Who's a bad guy? Who's a good guy? Or who's a heel? Who's a face? I'm sorry. I should use the nomenclature.
Right. Yeah. Sometimes I get my wrestling nomenclature messed up too. So yeah. Frank is actually excellent at that. When you talk to him, he'll tell you all that stuff.
He'll straighten you out.
Yeah, definitely. He straightened me out. But I think it's just like anything. These wrestlers find their niche. Some of them have been both, right? Good guys, bad guys. Some of them even vacillate between the two throughout the years. That you can't even keep track anymore. Who's good guys? Who's bad guy? I think the best wrestlers, in my opinion, are people like Ric Flair. They straddle that line. So they're so good that when they're bad, they're good, and when they're good, they're bad. It's like the audience loves them no matter what. Because Ric Flair has that ability. I think Don Muraco had that ability, where he was just so good that eventually that line of good between heel and babyface, that line diminishes, and you can't see it anymore. It blurs, right? Undertaker's another one.
I was just gonna say that he unleashed a whole subculture of fans,
right?
These are almost like Oakland Raider fans. We're gonna embrace the bad guy, right? We're gonna be the bad guy, right? Yeah,
right.
Yeah.
It makes being bad cool, because
of course, yeah.
Right. They're so good at it. They blur that line, and I think you can tell when somebody's really pushing an angle, like they're really trying to be the bad guy, and it just doesn't work, or they're really trying to be the good guy. Like for me, when Hogan went heel, I didn't buy it. It didn't, I get it. He changed his, his beard, grew it in and all that, and that was part of the darkness, right? He was bringing into the character, but I just didn't feel it. It was just too many years of him being American pie and wholesome, and eat your vitamins, brother.
Yeah.
Doing that whole thing. By the way, I do wrestling impersonations as well. That's another thing that I'm gonna talk about in the show too. Eventually, is how I started doing wrestling impersonations, because I was so into it that I would go outside and kids would, we'd talk about the wrestling matches of the day, and all of a sudden I'd like give them a recap of what was going on, and I'd break into a character, and then they'd be like, "Whoa, you did a good Hulk Hogan, man! How'd you do that?" So
I think everybody could do Macho Man Savage, but
while
I got you, I'm gonna try not to go down this rabbit hole. But there's one that I gotta ask for, if you could do it, is Jesse Ventura. Can you do it, Jesse?
It's a tough one, but I'm gonna try.
All right.
So I'm gonna give it a shot. Now, the government has a lot of conspiracies. If you read a lot of books about what the government says, I wouldn't trust it. He's got that Minnesota thing going on. It's not the best. That's my best Jesse.
That's pretty good. See, you need to have stuff like that and The Rock in the back pocket, because that crosses over these days, right? So you could get like you just implied, you could get some mileage beyond wrestling out of those impressions.
Yes.
At the Sports History Network, we're all about sports yesteryear, and so we're so pleased to introduce you to Row One, an online memorabilia gallery and shop that brings your sports history to life anywhere. The Row One gallery includes over 5,200 gorgeously reproduced prints of team posters, game program covers, game tickets, advertisements, and more in baseball, pro and college football, pro and college basketball, and more. And any gallery item may be printed in a variety of sizes on wood, metal, canvas, acrylic, or poster paper. And in Row One shop, check out the thousands more of unique items with the retro and historical designs dating back to 1876, including t-shirts, long sleeve shirts, phone cases, mugs, blankets, pillows, towels, and even shower curtains. Go to sportshistorynetwork.com, ROW1, for access to the full Row One catalog and for gallery prints and gift items. Plus, get a 15% discount off all prints on the Row One Pictorium Gallery with coupon code SHN15. Follow the link on the show notes.
I'd like to take a minute to tell you about quite possibly the greatest website of all time, newspapers.com. If you're listening to this podcast, or any of them at the Sports History Network, you're probably into sports history. And you probably also know that for learning about anything prior to, say, 1990 online, the typical search engines like are nearly completely useless. But then there's newspapers.com. Newspapers.com gives you access to over 640 million pages worth of news from North America, Britain, Ireland, and more, dating from 1798 to last week. Do up a search for Super Bowl I, the 36th Berlin Olympics, Wayne Gretzky's first game, whatever. Newspapers.com takes you there with historical flavor that search engines like just don't give you. And now, get a free 1-week subscription to newspapers.com by visiting sportshistorynetwork.com/newspapers. With a paid subscription, you'll also be helping to support the production of this podcast and other Sports History Network shows. That's sportshistorynetwork.com/newspapers. Newspapers.com. Way better for searches than you know what I'm talking about. Okay, Ariel, can you give us a teaser for some of your future episodes?
Yeah, absolutely. So I have an episode coming up soon about the Magnificent Muraco, and that episode has a little bit of a twist to it, because it's not going to be me talking necessarily. It's got a little bit more of a parody angle to it. And I also have an episode that I may be doing very shortly with Mr. Frank Redding of Ringside with Redding, where we're going to talk about the boxing wrestling connection and how those two sports have met in the past, sometimes with good results, most of the time with disastrous results. So we're going to have some fun with that.
We were talking a bit before the show, and you kind of surprised me saying that you don't really follow wrestling so much anymore these days. Why not, if I may ask?
Well, I think there came a point where it started to become more about the storylines. Well, I think, let me just take it from this way. When WCW and WWF were competing, I was at the apex of my fandom. I really enjoyed that time. And sometimes I was flipping back and forth between the two wrestling organizations. Even though I was more inclined to watch WCW, I was definitely switching back and forth. And when they became one and they merged, I said to myself, you know what, this is not going to be good. This is going to be boring. I'm basically, I like choices. And I like to be able to say, you know what, this is what I'm going to watch. And I felt like choice disappeared and it all kind of became very homogenized. And that's when I lost interest. I really felt like, oh, wow. So this is really just about one man, one organization, and forget about competition. I kept hoping that someone would emerge and give WWF a run for its money or WWE a run for its money, but never really happened. And I wasn't into the hardcore wrestling stuff. I know that was also an alternative, but as much as I love Abdullah the Butcher, I really was not into watching people, hit each other over the head with metal chairs and jumping off of barbed wire rope and stuff like that. I mean, I get it. I get there's a base for that, and that's cool. I'm not going to put it down, but it's just not for me because it's at that point it's just kind of like stunts. It's stunts. It's a lot of gimmickry, so to speak. And I really miss the old time wrestling. I know they call it wrestling, but I miss the wrestling part of it, the part where people were it was all about skills, it was about personalities clashing in the ring and settling feuds. And sometimes I think that all that has gone by the wayside, and what really has come down to is a lot of showmanship, a lot of gimmickry, and that's good for this crowd. I think it's a different, every generation has its favorite wrestlers, just like every generation has its favorite James Bond, right? You're gonna float in one direction, and that's cool. I'm never gonna knock any of that, but I know what appealed to me, and the day that WCW and WWE became one was when I took a nosedive.
Interesting. You bring up a good point about the homogenization, and it's pretty wild if you think about it. That when he took over the league, or the association, I guess you'd call it, from his father, Vince McMahon Jr., by the way,
right,
took his league from being, a regional concept, New England and Quebec, and going worldwide, bringing it worldwide. And in fact, making wrestling a household name in countries where it wasn't before, I mean, yeah, of course, Mexico, Japan, these countries have been fascinated with wrestling since, professional wrestling since day one. But, it's reaching places in Europe, like England is really getting into it, for example. Canada is completely enraptured at this point. I don't know if they were into it in the 80s, but right now, I almost know more Canadian wrestling fans than Canadian football fans at this point.
Right.
So, and it's ironic that in so doing, I mean, he basically laid waste to the entire wrestling environment. It basically became, almost a trust situation like Major League Baseball or any of the major sports leagues have in the US.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, just total domination just of the market. He just laid to waste every other league. Because when I was a kid, you had alternates. You had tons of alternate leagues. But...
Yeah, you did. And I think we were talking about the geography and how, you had regional wrestling. I love that. There was a time when I was growing up where, there was a Spanish station that you could tune into. It was a Channel 47 in New Jersey. I think it was in WNJU. But what I would do is I would go to that channel, and I only found out through other kids. Other kids in my class would be like, "Hey, if you want to watch Florida wrestling, tune in to the Spanish station after hours at 11:30. You can watch championship wrestling from Florida." And I said, "Get out of here!" So I would, sneak around my mom and my dad because they thought I was in bed sleeping, and I'd watch this Florida wrestling, and I'd be like, "Whoa!" I'd meet people like Ron Bass, the Funk Brothers, Terry and Dory.
Yep.
I never heard of these guys before because they were never in the WWF. So all of a sudden, my wrestling world opened up, and I was able to see all these really cool wrestlers that I didn't know anything about. And so it was great. And so regional stuff was awesome, or even WTBS. I mean, TBS at the time had the Georgia wrestling. Great stuff, through the Ted Turner network. But, this was all stuff. If you didn't have cable, or if somebody didn't give you some inside information like that, how else were you going to know about this stuff other than wrestling magazines,
Well, even cable is limited too. I remember for some reason in New England on Saturdays we used to get the Texas League, whatever that was, and the awesome thing about that one is that every week they had proper matches. Now, back in the day of the WWF, when Vince Jr. first took over, it was every week you would have 8 matches on a card, and it would be name versus SD Jones, or like Sancho. There was a Sancho, I forget what his last name was.
Right.
Sancho Morales or something like this.
Right.
Just some dude to beat on, and it was just like, it was so brutal. And so, but to get this Texas stuff was great because, you had proper matches every week. And, but I've noticed that this is something in our lifetime that has happened because of internationalism, like it or not, is that this homogeneity takes over all the sports. The thing about, like, for example, college football bowl games, that was great when you were kids, is you'd get something like BYU versus, Texas A&M. And these would be totally different styles of football. They had only played, schools from their area, and there were certain things that happened in your area, and this is the way you played football. And then you meet this totally different perspective in a bowl game. And it was great, or World Cup soccer is another example. All these teams used to play very differently. Now they look closer and closer and closer alike. And that's just because of internationalism. That's just because of and this homogeneity is taking over all the sports. Kind of happening in wrestling too. But I guess if you're a wrestling fan, you have high hopes these days for all elite wrestling, which is shaping up to be the AFL of professional wrestling. But
which is great. I mean, competition is always good in any industry, and that's I always hope for that. And the winners are the fans. When you get more choice, the fans always win, and that's the way it should be. I think also too that because you asked me about history earlier, because of the internet, because of YouTube and the accessibility. I had a conversation with a friend about this not too long ago too. We were talking about how everything is so accessible these days that history, it kind of cheapens history, because there was a time when you'd have to, if you were really curious about history, you'd have to really go out and search, do some research, maybe go to a library, maybe talk to somebody who had some knowledge about a particular sport, some expertise. Nowadays, if I want to look up a video or an old time fight, I just go on YouTube and do that. And although there's some benefit to that, I'm not poo-pooing it. I'm not saying it's bad. I'm just saying that it's so easy to do that it takes all the fun out of delving into history. It makes it so accessible, so easy.
Well, see, you say that, but here's the thing. Okay. And I know that there is some wrestling stuff from, let's say, the 80s. Okay. This era that we keep talking about. I know that there's some of that stuff on YouTube. Okay. But all of this stuff is heavily weighted to, guess what? Now, right? The 21st century at very least. Okay. And then the further you go back, the less likely you are to get video, the less likely it is for anybody to remember it. Right. So the internet is also killing, it may be great that you have video and stuff online, but it's almost like every time you put up a historical video, that's one other part of history that people are going to forget because it doesn't have a video.
Right.
So the internet is, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, no, and I mean to interrupt, but you can also never capture the feelings that you had when you first saw it. So you can watch whatever you want on YouTube, and that somebody who put that up there, they might remember what they felt when they first watched that, and they put it on YouTube. But you are just watching it like secondhand, third hand, right? But there's nothing like remembering something when you first saw it, because there's a lot more that goes into play than just watching whatever you're watching. It's what were you feeling that day? What happened to you before you started watching this? What happened to you afterwards? And so all these little connections are still a part of history, and YouTube and all the social media won't ever really replace that, because that's only stuff that comes from inside. And that's what I try to do on my show, is just bring that stuff that's inside me that I can't replicate on YouTube. I can't replicate anywhere else other than to draw it out of myself and put it out there. And you'd be surprised, as I was from my first show, when I got really nice reactions from a lot of people who said, yeah, I remember something similar to that, or, and then that made me feel good, because I said, wow, so I'm not the only one who felt that way. That's good. You make that emotional connection, because history is emotional. It's a living thing,
Oh, right. That's a great capper. Ariel Gonzalez of Wrestling with Heels On, a Sports History Network podcast. Thanks for joining us so much on the showcase.
Thank you so much for having me on. I appreciate it.
This has been the Sports History Network Showcase podcast. I'd like to thank our guest, Ariel Gonzalez of the Wrestling with Heels On podcast. The theme song for the SHN Showcase is Quartz by Anitech, and it is available through fair use agreement via freemusicarchive.org. SHN Showcase will be back soon with another Sports History Network podcast. Until then, this is Oz Davis saying stay safe and stay historical.
At the Sports History Network, we're all about sports yesteryear, and so we're so pleased to introduce you to Row One, an online memorabilia gallery and shop that brings your sports history to life anywhere. The Row One gallery includes over 5,200 gorgeously reproduced prints of team posters, game program covers, game tickets, advertisements, and more in baseball, pro and college football, pro and college basketball, and more. And any gallery item may be printed in a variety of sizes on wood, metal, canvas, acrylic, or poster paper. And in Row One shop, check out the thousands more of unique items with the retro and historical designs dating back to 1876, including t-shirts, long sleeve shirts, phone cases, mugs, blankets, pillows, towels, and even shower curtains. Go to sportshistorynetwork.com, ROW1, for access to the full Row One catalog and for gallery prints and gift items, plus get a 15% discount off all prints on the Row One Pictorum Gallery with coupon code SHN15. Follow the link on the show notes.